Welcome to Passion for Sound, the channel dedicated to thorough and honest reviews of headphones, earphones, DACs, headphone amps, other components and accessories. Basically everything audio related except power amps and passive speakers. My name's Lachlan and my goal is to explore and discuss all kinds of audio topics, even the controversial ones, to help us all find more enjoyment from music. Thanks for watching and enjoy the video. Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. Now imagine you've got yourself $30 to spend on a pair of IEMs. Maybe you're new to the hobby, or maybe you just like trying the cheap IEMs to see which of them punch way above their price point, because there are a few that do. Well, today's review, or actually I'm going to call it a Battle Royale, is just for you. I've taken 5 sub $30 IEMs and put them up against one another to see how they all perform. Hopefully by the end of this review, you'll have a sense of where to spend your $30 or less on your next IEM purchase. To get things started, let's introduce you to each of the IEMs that I've got here. And in some cases, I've got a thanks for the supplier of the IEM, so I'll share those along the way. Starting from cheapest to most expensive, we've got the CCA CSN. Now this was provided to me by AliExpress store Yao Tiger, so thank you to them for sending me the CSN. This is a $16 IEM. Yeah, that's 16. So it's incredibly affordable, and it's also not a bad IEM. I won't go into great detail right now, but it's a hybrid IEM consisting of one balanced armature and one dynamic driver per side. I'll come back around and talk about the design and the sound of each of these in just a moment, but for now let's continue with the introductions. Next up in price, we've got the BLON BL01. Many of you will have already heard of the BLON BL01. It's quite a well-known earphone, along with its sibling, if you like, in the BLON BL03 that we'll get to in a moment. The BLON BL01 is just $20, so it's also an incredibly affordable IEM, and in this case, it's a single dynamic driver. As we keep moving up, we now get to the Ear KS2. I reviewed this IEM in depth on the channel quite some time ago. It's another hybrid IEM with a single balanced armature and a single dynamic driver, and it comes in priced at $25. Then for just $2 more, you can get yourself the BLON BL03, which is widely considered one of the best budget IEMs in the world. At $27, you're getting yourself a single dynamic driver in the case of the BLON BL03, but one that is beautifully tuned and widely regarded. And for the final step, and brushing right up against the edge of what I considered the budget for this review, is the Ear Lark. I'd like to thank Ear themselves for sending me the Lark for review. It's one of the specific reasons that I'm doing this Battle Royale video, is that I had the Ear Lark here for $30, and then at the other end of the spectrum I've got the CCA CSN for just $16, and so I thought rather than waiting and doing 2 individual reviews, I'd just bundle all of these together and compare them all and share with you what I think the pros and cons of each are, and which of these I would spend my money on if I was dropping up to $30 on a pair of these IEMs. I should circle back quickly and also say my thanks once again to Keep Hi-Fi for sending me the Ear KS2 quite some time ago. We're ready now to talk about each of these IEMs. Before we do, I want to cover off a couple of things about what my process was in testing these, and also talk a little bit about why I've chosen these in particular. Let's start there. The reason I've chosen these is because these are the IEMs I had on hand. I've been sent 3 of them by suppliers or retailers, and I've bought 2 of them myself in the BLON BL01 and the BLON BL02. So as is always the case in all of my comparisons, I have to work with what I have here. No doubt there are other IEMs on the market that you'd love included in this comparison, but if I don't have them, I can't compare them. Hopefully though, what I'm going to say about each of these IEMs will give you enough of a sense of them to make an informed decision for yourself. And ideally, you'll have heard at least one of these, and that will help you to understand my preferences and also the differences with the other IEMs in this comparison. So now talking about my process for this, one of the biggest issues I've found with this level of IEM is that often the tips included are pretty mediocre. To keep things a bit more fair and reasonable, I did some tip rolling with each of these IEMs. For the most part, I used the Asla X Elastec tips, but in some cases, as I'll talk about when I get to the IEMs, a narrower board tip was preferable to help tame the treble. So I'll share with you as I go through what my preferred tip type was, but I did want to mention that I gave them all the same exact test with the same exact tips in order to form my initial opinions, and then I did a bit of tip rolling to see what the opportunities were just to tweak the sound a little bit and get the maximum performance out of each IEM. I didn't go so far as trying different cables because they don't all use the exact same connection. Some are a flush mount 2-pin connection, others are a sort of semi-recessed 2-pin connection, and so it was just easier if I stuck to the stock cable. Another part of my logic there is that it's very easy to buy a set of tips that you can move from one IEM to the next, and almost every IEM on the market will fit the same tip. Not all, but almost all. With cables though, things get quite different because you've got MMCX connectors, and then you've got the various 2 pins that are recessed, not recessed. You've got kind of the semi-recessed where there's a protrusion coming out of the earphone that goes up inside the cable socket. So there's lots of different connections with the cables, and therefore I think it's more difficult to buy one cable that you can move from IEM to IEM, but much easier to buy a set of tips that you can use across the board. So with that in mind, all of this testing was with the cable that came with the IEM, with one exception that I'll talk about shortly, and then with a range of tips that I tried using the X-Elastics, spiral dots, and also the spin fits. So without further ado, now that I've covered all that off, let's talk about each of the IEMs. Once again, I'm going to start at the cheapest and work my way up to the most expensive. Our first IEM, once again, is the CCA CSN. This came to me without a huge amount of expectation on my part. I hadn't read anything about it, I hadn't heard much about it, so I immediately was impressed when I opened up the packet and found some really nicely designed IEMs inside. These use a very basic, fairly cheap feeling plastic shell, but a nice metal front plate. They're a stylish looking IEM that's fairly subtle but also pretty cool to look at. They come with this silver plated cable that's quite fine, it's nothing special, but it's completely okay. It's about what I'd expect for an IEM at this price point. The set of tips that come with the CSN are also quite okay as well. Again, nothing to write home about, but what you expect for a budget IEM, and a lot better than a couple of others in this comparison. Now, whilst the tips themselves are okay, I do have one issue with the tips provided for the CSNs, and that is that some of the tips, when placed over the nozzle, actually still allow the top of the nozzle to be a little bit exposed. It's not that it's protruding, but it's flush with the top of the tip. And what that means is that when you put these in your ear, you may feel the cold metal pressing against your ear canal, and if you're not gentle with them, you could actually kind of scratch your ear canal a little bit with the end of the metal nozzle. It's not a sharp edge, so you're not at risk of doing lots of damage, but if you are a bit rough, you could easily do a little bit of kind of bruising to the ear canal, and that's not a great thing. So I'm not a huge fan of those tips. It's not an absolute deal breaker, but I would recommend buying something of a higher quality if you can. And I mean that in terms of the tips, not the IEMs. Another issue to talk about while we're talking about the nozzles is that with the various tip rolling that I tried, one of the nozzles actually popped out. Wasn't that one, it was obviously the other one, actually popped out entirely from the shell. That's not a great thing to see, and it does show that it's a fairly cheaply made IEM. Now the good news is that nozzle just pops straight back in and there's a little bit of friction holding it in place, but my concern is if you get a really good fit in your ear and you go to remove the IEM, there is a chance the nozzle may stay behind. So if that was to happen to you, I would definitely recommend getting just a tiny drop of super glue and gluing that back in place. I haven't bothered for this because I've been busy doing all the reviewing testing, but it's something I will do if I choose to keep these. And without giving away the game too much, the fact that the ASLA X-Elastic tips are still on these may give you a clue as to what I think about them. And with that in mind, let's talk about the sound. I think the CSNs are an absolute bargain for $16 US. These are an IEM that's incredibly well balanced for a cheap IEM. They're not perfect by any stretch. They've got a slight hollowness to the sound, but for what you're paying, they're incredibly impressive. They're resolving and detailed, they've got a nice sense of space, a good sense of punch and extension in the bass. They're really impressive to listen to. If I had to level a criticism at the CSNs, it would be that they can get just a tiny little bit sibilant at times, but it's very minor and only on certain tracks. That treble emphasis does also mean that they come across just a little bit hollow sounding in the vocals sometimes, but again it's track dependent and it's not particularly bad. It's one of those things where I did notice occasionally I just wanted a little bit more weight through the mid-range, but it never left me not enjoying the earphones. It was just something that I made a note of from a critical listening point of view. So all in all, I think the CSNs are an absolutely marvellous IEM. They're a tiny bit bulky compared to some of the others. They do stick out a little bit from the ears, but they're comfortable. I think they look great. They feel a little bit cheap, but they're fine. They don't feel like they're going to fall apart, other than that nozzle issue, of course. The cable is quite good, and indeed it's quite similar to what you're getting higher up in some of these other IEMs. And all in all, there's nothing I can complain about. I don't mean to give the game away here, but as I've already alluded to with the tips still being on them, I think the CSNs are probably my favourite IEM of this entire lineup. The fact that they're also the cheapest is a huge, huge bonus. But before you switch off the video and go buy yourself a set of CSNs, let's step through the other IEMs because others have pros and cons as well. So it's worth understanding A, what my preferences are, but also what other sounds you might be able to get from different IEMs here and which of them might suit you better. So the next step up in terms of price are the BLON BLO1s. The BLO1s here are kind of a redesign in some ways, or not a replacement, but a revision and another option from BLON, similar to the BLO3. I've seen it written around the place that they're what the BLO3 should have been and that they're the perfect version of the BLO3, and I don't agree with that, but I do believe they're a nice IEM. I've probably been too harsh on these in the past because I hadn't tried them with some different tips, and it does make a huge, huge difference with the BLO1. A big part of that is that the tip selection that comes with the BLO1 is absolutely woeful. They use a tip that sort of tapers in a conical way at the top end or the opening end, and therefore you never, at least in my case, you never get a really good seal. They then want to drop out of your ears, and the general ergonomics of the earphone I find to be just not ideal in the first place, and so unless you use different aftermarket tips, they're a pretty crappy IEM. When you get the right tips on them and the right insertion depth though, things are very, very different. Before I talk about the sound, I just want to mention a couple of other things. They have this really nice metal casing in much the same way as the BLON BLO3 does, and whilst I don't necessarily like the look of the design, they've got this kind of beveled groove through them that I'm not a huge fan of, and they've got the printing of the name that I don't particularly like. Some of those things aesthetically I'm not a fan of, but they feel well made, and that's important. The cable provided is just mediocre. It's probably on par with the rest of the IEMs in this category, but at the same time, it's not a great cable. With all that out of the way, let's start talking sound. The sound from the BLO1 is an extremely balanced sound as well, in much the same way as the CSN is. The difference between the two for me though is that the BLON BLO1 has a little bit more mid-range weight, and so whilst both are actually very detailed and resolving for a budget IEM, they also provide you detail and resolution in different ways. So where the CSN leans its detail into the upper mids and up into the treble, the BLO1 focuses the detail and resolution more in the upper mids down through the core of the mids. So it's a different sort of texture and detail experience that you get from the BLO1, and it does make them sound a little bit sweeter and a little bit smoother, but they're not at all thick or muddy or warm. There's just a slightly different emphasis on where the details lie. I found the mid-range from the BLO1 probably slightly preferable to the CSN, but at the same time, the treble from the BLO1 can get just a little bit splashy at times. Not sibilant in the way the CSN did, but just kind of a little bit overdone. There's a little bit too much splash, a little bit too much general energy in the treble, and that at times did take away from me from the overall listening experience. At the other end of the spectrum, the bass is well extended and very well controlled for a budget IEM. I think the bass from the BLO1 is comparable to the bass from the CSN, although the CSN might have just a little bit more punch and possibly a touch more extension. I think both of them are really well balanced though. There's not too much bass from them. There's a good amount both in terms of extension and in punch. I think bass lovers looking at these two probably should consider the CSN as being just slightly more punchy and full in the bass, but it's not a huge jump. Out of the two of these that we've talked about so far, I have a hard time choosing which one I would prefer. And the reason that I've currently chosen to spend more time with the CSNs comes more down to the comfort factor than it does to the sound. The ergonomics of the BLO1 to me are their biggest Achilles heel. If they'd gotten that just a little bit better with a better set of tips, I think they would be absolutely hands down one of the best, if not the best budget IEM on the market. As it is though, the ergonomics and fit, even with better tips, is never quite right for me, and that's where the CSN for me takes the win. Both are great, I would comfortably recommend both to anybody, but the CSN get my leaning. Even though the BLO1 is probably a little bit more balanced in its signature, the CSN is more comfortable, and therefore I get a more consistent fit and a more consistent sound. So far in our Battle Royale, the CSN is just coming out ahead, with the BLO1 running a close second. And that means it's time to bring in our next challenger. Now we're on to the KB Ear KS2. As a reminder, the KS2 is a $25 IEM, meaning that it's $5 more than the BLO1, and it's a full $9 more than the CSN. So I know that's not a huge amount in the scheme of things, $9 is not a big deal, but proportionally it's a big jump from the $16 CSN, and therefore you'd probably expect much better sound. Before we get to that, let's talk briefly about the ergonomics and design. The KS2 here is a nice teardrop style IEM that's a lot more compact than the fairly bulky CSN. The quality of the build also feels a little bit better in the case of the KS2. It's got a slightly nicer feeling plastic quality compared to the fairly cheap feeling CSN. The cable that comes with it is currently not attached because it's over here on the Lark, and I'll explain why that is shortly. For now though, all you need to know is it's a decent enough cable, but it is very prone to tangling in my experience. So that does go against it, but if you can get past the tangling issues, it's a decent enough feeling cable that seems well enough made. One thing that's really good about the KS2s is they've got a much better selection of tips than either of the options we've talked about so far. The tips still feel fairly cheap, but they're a good shape and they fully cover the nozzle, so you can generally find one that's going to give you a decent fit. You'll still get a better seal and probably an even better fit with things like spiral dots, X-elastics and spin fits, but it's not too bad from the stock KS2 tips. As a reminder, I did do tip rolling on all of these, and so I've chosen the optimal tips based on what I had for each of my sound tests to make sure I heard each IEM at its very best. For the first two IEMs, I think I forgot to mention, but I stuck with the X-elastics on both of them. In the case of the KS2, the X-elastics once again were my choice. By the way, I'll put some links down below to each of the tip types that I've used in this review, so you can go and check them out for yourselves if you want to pick up any of them and try them out. But now let's talk about the sound quality of the KS2. You might have already watched my review of these in the past, but just in case you haven't or you've forgotten what I said about them, they're quite a nice overall tuning for a hybrid IEM, but they're a little bit too V-shaped and just a little bit too bright for my tastes. They've got nice bass extension and weight, which is probably similar to the CSNs and therefore just a little tiny bit ahead of the BLO1. That means they've got a nice punchy sound through the bass, and generally bass through mids, they perform pretty comparably to the BLO1 and the CSN. Where things start to get a bit different though is in the treble. I find the overall sound from the KS2s to be just a little bit shouty. And no matter which tips I tried, even things with narrower bore that normally helps to pull back on the treble and the upper mids, I didn't find anything quite fixed the shoutiness of the KS2. It just meant that I constantly felt the need to turn them down a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more because they weren't a comfortable listen. The BLO1 and the KS2, despite being pretty cheap IEMs, I could listen to for hours on end. With the KS2 though, I don't feel like I could enjoy them for an extended listening period, and that's regardless of the source and regardless of the tips. For most of my testing, I was using the Chord Mojo, which is a fairly warm and forgiving sounding DAC and amp, but it didn't help to prevent the KS2s just coming across a little bit harsh. And probably harsh is the wrong word. The treble's smooth enough, it's just shouty and a bit overdone. One small benefit of the treble from the KS2s is that they do produce a nice sense of resolution and image, but the overall soundstage size is still more compressed than something like the BLO1, and so I just don't really see any benefits in the KS2 over and above the CSN or the BLO1. So for me, they're currently sitting third in this battle. And that's great news because it means so far the two cheapest IEMs are actually the best of this bunch. To see if that trend would continue, my next stop was the BLON BL03. This is an IEM that I've often recommended to people with the caveat that it's got the same wonky ergonomics, possibly worse ergonomics than the BL01. So you need to go into it knowing that you're getting a pretty weird fitting IEM. That said, I love the look of these. I think they look spectacular. They've got this really interesting kind of sort of distorted teardrop shaped IEM. They're available in chrome or more of a gunmetal finish, and I do think they look fantastic. It's a shame the nozzle angle and the general shape of them means they don't always fit effectively, and once again, this is an IEM like the BL01 where I think you absolutely need to invest in aftermarket tips if you want to get a good seal. In my case, I did enjoy these most once again with the X Elastex from Asla. The BL03 are also a single dynamic driver design like the BL01, and that brings pros and cons to their sound quality. What you'll often find is that dynamic drivers can be better with the imaging focus, so the central point of the image is clearer and more sharply focused, and also overall coherency is often better because they're not trying to split different frequencies between different driver types. In the case of the BL03 though, I do think it's falling a little bit short of some of the others in this comparison. Having previously been a huge fan, and actually previously having kind of written off the BL01s probably because I was using the wrong tips with them, I was pretty shocked when I went through this process to find that I comfortably preferred the BL01 now to the BL03. The reason for that is that in the sound signature of the BL03, there are lots of things that are interesting, but each of these other IEMs, or at least the ones that I consider better in this battle, those IEMs are doing everything better in different ways. But I'll talk it through to make more sense of that. So we're going to start with the bass. In terms of bass, the BL03 is probably the bassiest within this comparison, and it's definitely got more weight and sort of, I wouldn't say punch, it's got more weight and probably more fullness in the bass compared to either the CSN or the BL01 or the KS2. But the problem is that bass comes across a little bit slow, and I don't feel like it extends quite as deep as the bass from, say, the CSN. If you're a bass head, if you love a rich, warm sound, the BL03s would still be the winner in this battle for me, if that's your criteria. If though you're looking for a more balanced overall sound with greater resolution, the BL03s start to slip just a little bit. So the bass is a little bit too full and a little bit too slow compared to a couple of the others from a general overall balanced signature point of view, and at the same time they lack a bit of resolution in the top end. The treble from the BL03 can be a little bit grainy at times, and that gets in the way of a sense of crystalline clarity that the other IEMs in this battle can do. In fact, I'd probably say that of all 5 IEMs in this battle, I think the BL03 are probably the weakest on resolution. They do have other strengths in terms of that bass weight, and also another thing that I haven't mentioned yet is their mid-range tonality is probably the best of the bunch. Vocals and instruments that sit in that mid-range band have the most natural and realistic sounding tonality from the BL03s compared to any of the other IEMs in this battle. I think the BL01 probably comes as close as anything else does in the battle, but the BL03s just win out. So if you're craving a rich, realistic mid-range with good solid bass, the BL03s are still absolutely worth considering. But if you're looking for a more balanced overall soundstage with good space and good general resolution and smoothness through the treble, then I do think you should be looking at the CSN or the BL01. And with that in mind, I'm going to say that I think the BL03 and the KS2 probably sit about equal in third place for me. The KS2 will be better for those that want a brighter signature with an emphasis on the treble, and the BL03 will be better for those that are looking for a tilt into the warmth and the bass. If you're looking for pure balance, the CSN and the BL01 still sit 1 and 2 respectively. And so that leaves one final challenger in the KB Ear Lark. The Lark sits right at the $30 limit for this battle, and therefore was the top of the range option with the top of the range expectations. Given that it's more than the KB Ear KS2, I obviously expected better sound from it than the KS2, and given that it's stepping up in price significantly from something like the $16 CSN, I was really expecting good things. Now, one thing that you get when you buy the Lark is this is the only IEM here that comes with a case. It's a hard case, and it's pretty compact, but it does seem to have just enough space for the IEMs. I like the look of it and the feel of it. It's a nice kind of fabric of some sort. And so I was happy to see that at this level of price, you're starting to get some extra accessories. The tips are also quite good with the Lark, and similar to the KS2, they're the best fitting and feeling of the lot in terms of both ergonomics and also quality. They're still a generic, fairly budget tip, but I do think it's the best set of tips that I've seen in this whole battle. That said, I still tried different tips with the Lark to make sure that it was performing at its peak when compared to the others. And in the case of the Lark, what I found was that I tended to like them the most with a narrower bore tip. So something like the Spinfits or indeed their stock tips were actually pretty good. Before I talk about the sound though, just to finish off some of the design and ergonomics, the Larks are quite a nice looking IEM. They've got these metal faceplates that are really nicely finished. They're sort of a brushed satin finish with an embossed kind of design in them, and they look really good. I chose to get the kind of mauve, violet, lavender, I'm not sure what colour it is, but the purpley coloured shells because I was looking just for something different rather than having everything look the same, and I quite like the overall look of them. Once again, they're compact. Despite being a hybrid design, they've kept the shell fairly small. So they're going to nestle into the ear nicely and are also fairly comfortable. One thing I didn't mention with the KS2 and also the Lark, these are both very similar in this regard, is that the nozzles are quite long and they're also quite thick in terms of diameter. And so that does mean that you may find at times they're harder to get a really comfortable fit if you've got a short ear canal before the first bend. The good news is that with the right tips, you can still get them to fit nicely, but you may not get a deep insertion that you can with the slightly narrower tip of something like the CSN. The final thing that I want to talk about with design with the Lark is the cable itself that comes with the Lark is actually a silver cable, very similar to the one that comes with the CSN. The reason you're not seeing it here is that it broke almost immediately the first time I took them out of the case. Now, I'm exceedingly careful with my IEMs and their cables, and I've never ever had a cable break before. That's not true. I've had one cable break once upon a time. So in all of my years, with all of the different IEMs I've tried, I've only ever had one cable break. That one broke after many, many months, maybe years of regular use. So to have a cable die, having only removed it from the box, listened to it briefly, coiled it up and carefully put it inside the case, that's a little bit concerning to me. These things can happen, so I don't want to put too much weight on it, but I did want to flag that it's a little bit of a concern, particularly given this is actually the most expensive IEM out of this range of sub $30 IEMs. So for the vast majority of my listening, I've been using the KS2 cable instead of the stock cable that comes with the Lark. I don't believe it's going to make a significant difference to the sound, so I proceeded with that, and hopefully it hasn't altered my results. I'm fairly confident that the cable won't have though, because the sound from the KB Ear Lark was the most removed from all of the other four, and the cable couldn't have that much influence over the sound. What I heard from the Lark was a much brighter tuning earphone that's got much less bass and much more overall emphasis on mid-range and treble detail, and specifically upper mid-range and treble detail. The Lark is kind of like the KS2 with some of the bass taken away and a bit more treble added in. That does result in potentially slightly more resolution and a more kind of neutral-ish reference sound depending on how you define that, but for me it's overall a step backwards, I think, from the KS2. That is a personal thing though. I like my earphones to have a little bit of warmth and a bit of extension and weight in the bass. They don't have to necessarily be bass monsters like the BLO3, but I do like them to have a little bit of punch and a little bit of soul. And that's where I found the Lark was just a little bit lacking. On certain genres where you're not looking for bass extension or bass weight, there's a really good chance the Lark could be the best option of this bunch, because the treble quality and resolution are both generally quite good. The problem is it does occasionally get a bit splashy, and of course it's not overall a balanced signature because it is lacking in the bass. What bass is there is very tight and well controlled, it's very fast, but it just doesn't extend deep enough, and it also doesn't have enough weight. One of the tracks I was using for all of these reviews was Wartime Prayer by Paul Simon. The reason I was using that is that in the very opening passage of this track, there is a really deep but very low level rumble coming through from the bass. It was a great way for me to work out which of these earphones had the deepest extension and the most weight down low. In all 4 of the IEMs before the Lark, I was able to get some semblance of that rumble coming through the IEMs. In the case of the Lark though, there was 0 rumble. If I hadn't known it was there, I wouldn't really have known what was going on. There was a sound, but it didn't come across as any kind of a rumble. It was like the dynamic driver just managed to get the very top end of the sound, but was missing the main bulk of that rumble, and therefore there was just a sound within the bass overall. But it was a relatively short sound rather than an extended rumble. So with that in mind, I'd once again say that I think the Lark is an earphone that might work on very, very specific kind of light, chamber, acoustic, vocal focused genres where you're really not looking for any bass. That said, I don't see any benefit in the Lark over something like the CSN or the BLO3 that also both will handle those genres beautifully, but then still have the weight if you're listening to something that needs a bit more punch. And so at this point, I'm unfortunately going to put the Lark at the very bottom of this 5 IEM shootout. And what that means is that somewhat ironically, we've gone in terms of order of price, we've gone from cheapest to most expensive, with the cheapest being the best and the most expensive, for me at least, being the worst of this bunch. Now I want to apologise to KB Ear for putting the Lark at the bottom of this comparison because they were kind enough to send me this unit. And obviously I never want to say bad things because I'd love to have more products like this sent out for reviews. So I do apologise to KB Ear, but the reality is I just don't see a justification for spending the $30 on the Lark when their very own KS2 I think is a little bit better, and definitely the BLO1 and the CSN to me are clearly better. So KB Ear, I hope in the future we can collaborate with other IEMs. I think the products you're putting out are really nicely designed, they look great, they feel great, the accessories are well done. So all in all, I think it's a really good looking and feeling product. I just am not necessarily a fan of the overall tuning, and that unfortunately is what's bringing it undone here. So to bring all this together now, I just want to provide a quick conclusion by saying that to me, the CSN is the absolute winner comfortably in this battle. The reasons for that are a few. First of all, I think they're one of the most comfortable IEMs in this battle, and when you combine that with the fact that they're either the best or the second best sounding IEM in this battle in terms of overall balance, resolution, detail, general sound quality, I think they're really, really hard to go past. The BLO1 may be slightly better on overall sound quality in terms of a more balanced signature and a slightly better soundstage, but at the same time, there is a really good chance you're not going to be able to enjoy that because you might not get the right fit. I think in both cases, you absolutely need to factor in the purchase of some aftermarket tips because I don't think either ships with tips that are good enough to get the most out of the IEM. In the case of the CSN, it could be because the tips leave that top of the nozzle exposed and it's a bit uncomfortable, and with the case of the BLO1, they're probably just going to not seal and fall out of your ears. So you do need to factor that into the price, and that does automatically mean that they may end up overall costing a little bit more than the $30 price tag. The good news is once you buy those tips, if they're silicone tips at least, you're going to be able to use them over and over again on every IEM you ever buy. To give you an idea of that, I use the same tips that I'm using on the $16 CSNs here. I use those same tips on my multi-$1,000 64 Audio U12T. So to my mind, it's a good investment to buy silicone tips because you can use them over and over again on all different IEMs, and it gives you the ability to subtly tune the different IEMs that you might purchase. Once again, if you're somebody that wants a richer, warmer, bassier sound, the BLO3 is absolutely still worth considering. It's a really nice IEM. And if you're a fan of V-shaped signatures, the KS2 is not a bad choice. I don't think it sits on the same level as the CSN or the BLO1, but it's still an okay IEM. Sadly for me, the Lark lags a bit behind because of its lack of bass extension. It means it lacks in fun and soul for me, and therefore is going to be limited to very specific tastes and or very specific genres. So hopefully, having heard all this, it's provided you with some direction on where to spend your next $30 on a pair of IEMs. As always, I'll place links to all of these IEMs down in the description below, as well as to the tips that I used in this review. If you found this review useful, as always, I'd love it if you'd hit like, consider subscribing to the channel, and maybe share it on your favourite audio forums such as HeadFi, Superbest Audio Friends, StereoNet Australia, New Zealand, or wherever you live. It would be great for you to share this video with others who might also be looking for recommendations in the sub $30 IEM category. For now though, I'll leave you to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.